I was just Oliver, a college student in Wiltshire, England, struggling to pay the bills. My scholarship barely covered the books, and college seemed a distant dream. It was then that the only job I found appeared: catalog files in an abandoned hospital for decades. Blackwood Hospital. What started as a simple task to pay for college, however, quickly turned into my worst nightmare. The autumn wind in Wiltshire, England, not only brought the damp smell of earth and decaying leaves, but also a shiver that went beyond cold. I shrugged my shoulders inside my jacket, watching the lights of that little town out one by one. The scholarship was not even covered half of the tuition of the Faculty of Literature, and the work I got, after countless no, was my only hope. However, Blackwood Hospital was not the kind of place where someone accepted a job for pure convenience. Rumors said the Blackwood had closed over 50 years due to an inexplicable epidemic, but the whispers in the city painted a much darker picture. There were stories of patients who disappeared, shouts that echoed through the empty corridors at night, and an oppressive atmosphere that performed long after the last nurse closed the door. I tried to ignore the rumors, remembering the generous amount that promised me. After all, my task was simple: cataloging the old medical files before the building was demolished. A lonely work, yes, but apparently harmless. The hospital van, a rusty relic that seemed to have been rescued from a junkyard, stopped in front of the forged iron gates. They were open, as a silent invitation to the unknown. The driver, a taciturn man with eyes that seemed to have seen too much, just pointed to the main entrance. "Just follow straight, boy. The file key is on the time clock." And without another word, he left, leaving me alone in the dimness of dawn. Blackwood's imposing Gothic facade rose against the gray sky, its broken windows looking like empty eyes that watched me. The thick ivy dragged on the stone walls, giving the impression of pulsating veins over a dying body. A cold shiver traveled my pimple, but I forced myself to move on. The metallic creak of the main door echoed through the dark, dusty hall, a sound that seemed to last for eternity. The flashlight of my cell phone could barely penetrate the dense darkness, revealing only indistinct figures and dancing shadows. The air inside the hospital was heavy, with a peculiar smell of mold, old chemicals, and something more, something I couldn't identify, but it caused me a rapping in my stomach. I found the rusty point clock, his pointed pointer in the 1970s. He has an old and heavy key, cold to the touch. The file of the files was underground, according to the instructions. While descending the spiral staircase, the silence of the hospital became deafening, broken only by the echoes of my own steps and, occasionally, for a distant rustle that I tried to convince myself it was the wind. When opening the file door, the air inside was even denser, almost suffocating. Batteries of dusty boxes and rusty metal cabinets filled the space, exuding an acre smell of old paper and oblivion. The lantern light revealed spider webs that looked like mortuary veils and a thick layer of dust that covered everything. As I took the first step in, a soft noise came from one of the adjacent corridors, a dragged sound, as if something heavy was being dragged on the floor. I stopped, my heart beating mismatched. "Hello," I called, my voice a little more trembled than I would like. The only answer was the echo of my own voice getting lost in the darkness. I shook my head, trying to calm down. It was just my imagination, tired and overloaded. I had to focus on work. I turned on the portable light I brought, which shed a weak light on the first cabinets. As I bowed to catch one of the boxes, a cold, inaudible sigh, he brushed my back of his neck, and the peculiar smell in the air intensified, now with a metallic touch, like old blood. I turned abruptly, but there was nothing. Only the darkness and oppressive silence of the Blackwood, which seemed to swallow me whole. I tried to convince myself that I was just scared, but a deeper cold, which was not coming from the temperature, began to spread through my bones. It was as if the hospital's own structure was alive, breathing around me, not in a friendly way. I knew, with a certainty chilling, who was not alone there. And whatever was with me, it didn't seem to be intended to let me go. The still air of the archives room was a heavy blanket. Every fiber of my being screamed at me to run away, to convince myself that it was all just fatigue and the suggestion of the city's rumors. But that metallic smell, the cold breeze on the back of my neck, and the distant shuffling, no, I wasn't imagining it. I decided the best strategy was to keep busy. Maybe work would distract me from the terror that was beginning to set in. I took a deep breath, trying to ignore the feeling of being watched, and began dragging one of the dusty metal boxes. The dry clunk of the metal on the floor echoed in the room, seemingly amplified by the oppressive silence. The box was crammed with old medical records, yellowed with age. The patients' names seemed to whisper their own stories from within the musty pages. Case number 347, Sarah Jenkins, admitted in 1968, high fever and delirium. Case number 512, Thomas Blackwood, same last name as the hospital, admitted in 1970, progressive memory loss and auditory hallucinations. My focus was lost in every detail, every blurred line that seemed to tell something terrible. With each chart I flipped through, the room seemed to grow denser. I felt a growing pressure, as if the walls were closing in. Suddenly, a noise. Not a drag, but a creak, like an old chair being moved. It came from the hallway to my left, the same one I'd heard the drag from earlier. My body froze. I stared into the darkness of the hallway, the dim beam of my flashlight barely reaching the bend. "Is anyone there?" I asked, my voice barely passing through my dry throat. The silence that followed was even worse. It was an active silence, charged with expectation, as if something were testing me. I decided I couldn't stand there, paralyzed by fear. I needed to go to the bathroom, and I knew it was at least one floor up. The problem was, the way back was through the darkness of the hospital. I gathered all the boxes I'd set aside and organized them with trembling hands. I tried to convince myself it was just rats, the wind, anything but what my mind was beginning to suggest. As I climbed the stairs, each wooden step creaked under my weight, amplifying my fear. The light from my cell phone's flashlight swept the empty hallways, revealing rusty, overturned beds and abandoned stretchers. A sense of desolation hung in the air, mingled with the lingering smell of disease and despair. I reached the main floor. The darkness was almost absolute, broken only by my light and the broken windows, which revealed the outdoor courtyard shrouded in a creeping fog. It was then that I distinctly heard a whisper. It wasn't a clear sound, but a collection of low, distorted voices coming from somewhere upstairs. They sounded like wails, unintelligible words, but charged with profound pain. My heart raced. It wasn't rats, it wasn't the wind. Those were human sounds. But how? The hospital had been closed for decades. I ran to the nearest bathroom, my body in a cold sweat. The rusty faucet barely dripped, and the water that came out was cloudy. I splashed it on my face, trying to calm myself, trying to rationalize. As I stared at myself in the cracked mirror, for a split second, I swore I saw something behind me. A pale, almost translucent form, moving quickly in the dim light. I spun around, gasping, but there was nothing. Just my pale, frightened image reflected in the mirror. I needed to get out of there. College was important, but it wasn't worth my sanity. I grabbed my things and began walking quickly back to the main entrance. But just as I turned the corner to the exit, a door at the end of the hallway slowly opened, with a dragging creak that seemed to tear the air. The beam of my flashlight revealed a hospital room, with a simple bed and a rusty cabinet. And in the center of the room, as if waiting for me, a wheelchair. It was empty, but the wheels seemed to have just stopped turning. And then, what came next was more terrifying than any gasp or shuffle. On the notice board above the bed, written in ancient, hurried handwriting, I read, "They won't let us out." A scream built in my throat, but I swallowed it. The air around me turned frigid, and the metallic smell intensified, almost suffocating me. I knew it wasn't my imagination, nor my exhaustion. I was trapped. The scream that had built in my throat caught. They won't let us out. The hurried handwriting on the board, the empty wheelchair, the frigid air surrounding me, everything solidified into a terrifying certainty. I wasn't alone, and whatever was there wasn't benign. The metallic smell, which I now perceived as old blood, filled my nostrils, choking me. The only thing my mind could register was escape. I ran down the hallway, stumbling in my own fear. The light from my cell phone's flashlight danced, creating grotesque shadows that seemed to reach out to grab me. Every beat of my heart echoed in my ears, mixed with distant whispers that seemed to come from the walls, the ceiling, from everywhere at once. They were wails, calls, words I couldn't decipher, but which carried a palpable anguish. I reached the front door, my breath short. The door, which had once creaked invitingly, now seemed to have swallowed the sound. I pushed, forced, used all my weight, but it was locked. Not with a key, but as if something were holding it shut from the outside, or perhaps from the inside. Panic rose in my throat, and I began pounding on the old wood, my hoarse voice calling for help. No one would come. No one was around. The van had left, and the city slept, oblivious to the terror unfolding within those walls. Desperately, I searched for an alternative. The windows were sealed or broken, with sharp shards that blocked any escape. My eyes swept the dusty lobby, searching for a way out, anything. It was then that I saw it. A small, barely visible wooden door next to the reception desk. A rusty, half-loose sign read, "Morgue." My legs trembled, but a strange force propelled me forward. The hospital wouldn't let me go through the front door. Maybe there was another exit that way. I pushed the door open, and it gave way with a muffled groan. An even more pungent smell of formaldehyde and death hit me, forcing me to take a step back. My phone's flashlight illuminated a steep staircase that descended into darkness. There was no other way. I descended step by step, each step echoing in a sepulchral silence. The air grew colder, and moisture clung to my skin. At the end of the stairs, a narrow, dark corridor stretched out, with metal doors on either side. The whispers returned, louder now, as if coming from the very walls of the morgue. They were agonized, pleading voices. I opened the first door on the right, expecting to find an empty room or more filing cabinets. But what I saw froze me. It was the morgue. The room was lit by a single bulb hanging from the ceiling, which flickered intermittently, creating an eerie strobe effect. In the center sat a stainless steel table, and on top of it, a man. He was lying on his back, wearing a white nightgown, already faded and torn in several places. His eyes were open and staring at the ceiling, but lifeless. What really shocked me were his legs. They were terribly injured, with open wounds and a purple-greenish tinge. And from his mouth, a thick green liquid dripped, slowly drooling down the side of his face and dripping onto the table with a sickening sound. The liquid seemed alive, bubbling slightly. And then, the whispers from the hallway intensified, almost becoming a chorus of voices. They seemed to be coming from the man himself at the table. I took a step back, staggering. But the horror didn't end there. As I watched, paralyzed, one of the man's fingers, his index finger, began to move slowly. He was pointing, with agonizing slowness, at my own leg. And that was when I felt it. A sharp, throbbing pain in my own leg, in the exact spot the man had pointed to. It was a pain that hadn't been there a second before, an intense burning that made me scream. I looked down and saw my pants, at calf level, were stained with a green liquid. The same liquid that was dripping from the man's mouth on the table. My eyes widened in terror. This wasn't an ordinary haunting. This wasn't a ghost that frightened me. It was something contagious, something that spread. The man on the table wasn't dead. Not in the conventional sense. He was patient zero. The patient of the unexplained epidemic that had closed Blackwood. And I, by entering the hospital, by touching those dusty boxes, by breathing that thick air, had become the next. I looked back at the man. His lips moved, and a hoarse but perfectly audible whisper escaped his drooling mouth. "Now, you can't leave." Desperation drove me. The pain in my leg was excruciating, but the man's hoarse voice, "Now, you can't leave," gave me a rush of pure adrenaline. I couldn't give in. Not there, not like that. My leg burning, I dragged myself out of the morgue, the sound of whispers and the nauseating smell following me. My mind, previously focused on escape, now worked at breakneck speed, searching for any memory of the initial instructions. The driver had mentioned a service exit at the back, near the laundry room. It was my only chance. With each step, the pain in my calf intensified, but I barely felt it. Panic blinded me to everything but the darkness of the hallways. I stumbled between dusty gurneys, dodged overturned chairs, and finally spotted a door that looked more like an emergency exit. With a last effort, I pushed the panic bar. The door creaked and swung open into the cold night. The wet grass beneath my feet was the most glorious feeling I'd ever experienced. I didn't look back. I ran, limping, across the hospital grounds, through the wrought iron gates that had once welcomed me. I kept running until the city lights were visible, and then I collapsed. I woke up in a hospital bed, but not at Blackwood. I was in a modern, clean hospital, under the concerned gaze of doctors and nurses. The green substance in my leg had been identified as a rare toxin, a kind of bacterial poison that, luckily, they managed to contain in time. They believed I'd been exposed to some ancient and dangerous substance during the cataloging work. No one asked me about the man in the morgue, and I didn't have the courage to tell them. How could I explain what I felt and saw? I was discharged a few weeks later, with a nasty scar on my leg and a much greater trauma in my mind. I got a new job and worked hard to return to school. I graduated from college, but the experience at Blackwood changed me forever. My life was never the same again. Sleep was an uncertain refuge, haunted by nightmares of that green liquid and the whispers of agonized voices. Each time the cold air brushed the back of my neck, I felt the phantom breeze of Blackwood. And the smell, the metallic, acrid smell of death never completely left me, emerging at the most unexpected moments. I knew I had narrowly escaped, but Blackwood left its mark. A physical scar, yes, but mostly a mark on my soul, a constant reminder that the world holds dark secrets, and some places, once opened, never allow their truths to be completely sealed.